Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show. In 2016, Niantic released the augmented reality app Pokemon Go. Using their mobile device, players would hold up their phones and, using the camera, hunt reality for monsters from the Pokemon franchise. If they got lucky, a creature would appear on their screens as though they really existed in the nooks and crannies of the real world. It became one of the most profitable apps with more than 500 million downloads. Businesses, schools, and even churches would designate spaces on their campuses where players could come and hunt for monsters. I remember playing it in downtown Seattle. I felt a little dumb wandering around with my phone in front of my face, moving it all around and looking through it like Sherlock Holmes would looking through a magnifying glass for clues. Immediately I saw the appeal though. I mean, who doesn't want to hunt for hidden things in a world of common materials like asphalt, glass, and dirt? However, there was a dark side, a deadly side. People became so engrossed in their hunt for monsters that they lost sight of reality, literally. According to the website PokemonGoDeathTracker.com, yes, it's real, 26 people have died and 64 have been seriously injured while playing the game. For example, on December 3, 2018, a man had his leg amputated after falling onto a railway track while playing the game. And as recently as August 29, 2022, a man lost control of his car and died while playing the game behind the wheel.
Pokemon characters are also showing up in unexpected places like the delivery room and next to police at a protest in Oakland. But not all encounters are peaceful. Outside of St. Louis, these 3 suspects were arrested for allegedly using Pokemon Go to lure unsuspecting players into armed robberies.
Whether digital, literal, historical, metaphorical, monster hunting is a dangerous business, especially Christians whose history is haunted by realities such as witch trials, medieval werewolf trials, and satanic panics. While Pokemon tells us that we gotta catch 'em all, Proverbs tells us that in all our getting, we need to get understanding. Today, I want to suggest a framework for hunting monsters that hopefully prevents us from becoming monstrous ourselves and leads us to practice greater discernment that results in deeper understanding. I'm calling this episode Beast Practices, a philosophy for monster hunting. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Each spring, I teach a class called Monsters, Faith, and Pop Culture. Because I teach at a faith-based institution, I have to put some qualifiers on the course in order to avoid misunderstandings and people chasing after me with torches, pitchforks, and angry emails.
Remember, get him alive if you can, but get him!
Using my in-class monster hunting philosophy, I have crafted a philosophy for this podcast that contains 7 points I think will be helpful as we explore various topics. Point number 1. We practice discernment, not demonization. In my experience, most faith-based content exploring popular culture tends to fall into one of 2 traps. The first is thinking that any form of entertainment or media that isn't directly produced by a church is part of a secret cabal of satanic forces working with entities like the Illuminati or Freemasons to ruin the world. These programs connect the symbols to find occult messages that are brainwashing, possessing, or casting spells on the consumers. Now let me say I don't deny the presence of occult symbols in popular culture, but one of the common beasts we have to deal with in the world are trolls, who love to provoke a reaction among hypersensitive Christians because it increases their share of attention. As an aside, many Christian ministries rely on sensationalism for the exact same reason. It gets clicks and views that translate to dollars. Beyond that, wild stories and dark fantasies spring up around certain media that become an example of our worst fears realized. People are swept away in bandwagon-style propaganda, basically going along with something because it seems like everyone else is. They become willing to believe uninvestigated claims that reach dizzying heights of horror. A recent example of the sensationalism trap occurred in September 2019, when Reverend Dan Rehill decided to ban Harry Potter from St. Edward Catholic School in Nashville. While religious institutions banning certain books isn't unusual, Pastor Rehill claims to have made his decision by consulting exorcists in the US and Rome, leading him to conclude that, quote, "The curses and spells used in the books are actual curses and spells, which, when read by a human being, risk conjuring evil spirits into the presence of the person reading the text," end quote. There's a lot of ways to critique Harry Potter books, but claiming the made-up words in the book, which are claimed by no known religious group, or words that are simply in Latin, are real spells, strains credulity. A more recent example is Jamie Gooch, an evangelical mother from Texas, who claims that Disney's new Hocus Pocus 2 might, quote, "unleash hell on your kids and in your home. The whole movie is based on witches harvesting children for blood sacrifices," end quote. She further claims, quote, "I believe whatever comes on our TV screens, there are things attached to that. I've seen for myself the things I've watched with my eyes or heard over a TV screen. They've become manifested in real life, and then I think, oh my gosh, what did I consume?" End quote. She was even lampooned on SNL.
And we don't need to see Bette Midler wearing big old teeth.
It's satanic.
Okay, worst case scenario, it could unleash hell.
Imagine that, okay? I'm sorry, just imagine that. You're home with hell in it.
Again, giving a careful critique to films with occult themes is good, but insinuating that hell, spells, or things on the screen will materialize in real life to terrorize viewers belongs more to panic theology or self-fulfilling prophecy rather than genuine media effects based on good, theoretically informed and documented research. Of course, this is where people will insert their personal testimonies of coming out of the occult or claim their friend or random unnamed people told them stories from their time in the occult. And while it's important to listen to people's stories, the difficult and sad reality is we have a long documented history of false and sensational testimonies crafted by professed Christians in order to build animosity towards Catholics and other groups of people. While we will talk more about some of those specifically later on in the season, a couple examples to think about include the salacious and false tale, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, published in 1836, a sordid tale created by Protestants to invoke suspicion and even violence against Catholics. One of my favorite accounts can be read in The Protestant Crusade by Ray Allen Billington. Additionally, the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, and the Satanic Panic of the 1980s saw moralpreneurs taking advantage of people's fears and spinning horrifically false tales like Michelle Remembers, a book we'll look at in episode 14. Let me be clear, occult practices and cultic practices need scrutiny and investigation, but so do the testimonies created by those looking to grow their media ministry market shares. Don't use lies to tell the truth. The other issue with sensationalist approaches is that it tends to do the opposite of what the critic wants. One of my seminary professors once had his books banned from a bookstore in Michigan for taking a theological stance that disagreed with church administration. The result? He sold more books there than ever before. Last year, I polled my students and asked them how many had been banned from certain books, shows, and movies growing up. Most said yes. Then I asked, how many of them watched them anyway? Most said yes. We need better approaches than simply banning everything in the most colorful language we can find. Of course, the other trap is becoming a type of pop culture apologist who, being burned by the aforementioned conspiracy theorists and sensationalists, reacts by going to the other extreme, namely believing every popular culture artifact is good and should be consumed. Part of being a thoughtful media critic is offering critique, what's good and what's not so good. While everyone has their fandoms and things that they love, nothing is perfect or beyond critique. Plus, individual people also don't react to media the same way. Some people can play an app on the phone safely in their free time, and others kill pedestrians. See PokemonGoDeathTracker.com. We'll come back to this idea later. I once had someone on Twitter tell me literature has no influence on behavior at all because it's fiction. However, even a casual look at discussions of representation in the media reveal that what happens on the page and on the screen has a very important influence on perception and behavior. Consider how meaningful it was to the African American community when Black Panther was released and Africa was portrayed as a powerful, technologically advanced place instead of a backwards, primitive location.
My name is King T'Challa, son of King T'Chaka. I am the sovereign ruler of the nation of Wakanda. And for the first time in our history, we will be sharing our knowledge and resources with the outside world. Wakanda will no longer watch from the shadows. We cannot. We must not. We will work to be an example of how we as brothers and sisters on this earth should treat each other.
Conversely, consider the controversies that surround films when a white actor like Scarlett Johansson is hired to portray an Asian character as in Ghost in the Shell. It's very easy to make declarations banning or embracing things without coming together and reasoning through them. And it's very easy to jump on the latest panic bandwagon or cultural trend when popular preachers and influencers are telling us what to do or not to do. 1 John 4:1 tells us not to believe everything, but test the spirits. Basically, use our brains when examining something instead of falling into absolute binaries of all good and all bad when it comes to human media and culture, which brings me to the next point. Number 2. Most things are a mix. There's a popular aphorism that floats around that says, "The devil likes to mix truth with error." The idea, of course, is that an effective lie has to contain some truth to be believable. However, people run with this in ways that says if there's any inaccuracy or any imperfection in something, then it's all bad and must be thrown out as a diabolical plot of the enemy. But what human communicator is infallible? What human artist produces objectively perfect and true art? What preacher is 100% objectively accurate and truthful in their sermons and exegesis of sacred texts all the time? What parent never makes mistakes? Ask your favorite author or speaker what they think of their early work. Better yet, make them read it or watch it. It's not all bad, but it's a little rough. At some level, human communication and media always has flaws. Sometimes there's intention and a will to deceive, and other times it's people trying their best with the tools or budget or knowledge they have. Sometimes there is irresponsible media, and other times, if we don't like something, it's more about our personal preferences and styles. Closely related to this is fundamental attribution error, which I mentioned in my last episode. It points out that we often attribute negative internal motivations for external actions. For example, we see the term ghost story and label the author a spiritualist or an occultist. But keep in mind, many Victorian Gothic fiction authors were Christians using the medium of the ghost story to haunt secular audiences with questions of divine judgment in the afterlife. To read more about that, you can check out the book The Victorian Ghost Story and Theology by Zoe Lehman-Imfeld. What's more, we forget that in Luke 16, Jesus tells a story of two people who die and then have a conversation in the afterlife in order to haunt the living with justice. That parable also demonstrates how things are true in different ways, such as telling a fictional story to demonstrate a literal truth. It would be more honest to say that you just don't like something or someone's approach, rather than inventing an intricate villain origin story for them. So for our purposes, most things are a mix of good and bad, truth and error, perfect and imperfect, and we need to use good tools to extract what's good and leave behind what isn't. Number 3. Just because something is discussed doesn't mean it's endorsed. People have a bad habit of thinking that just because something is mentioned, quoted, or discussed, it means that it receives full endorsement. I once used a football metaphor in a column I wrote.
McDermott is the snapper, and the kick is no good!
I explained how a recently disappointing game killed a team's Super Bowl hopes and ruined what felt like a great story that had been unfolding all season long. I noted that all of us have stories we felt didn't get the best ending. Someone sent a letter to the editor criticizing the magazine for endorsing sports-related head injuries simply because I mentioned football in my piece. In this podcast, a lot of things will be discussed, but making mention of, say, a slasher film from the 1980s, the medieval church's werewolf trials in Europe, or colonizing efforts of Jesuit missionaries doesn't mean I or the guests on this podcast give them a blank check endorsement. Scripture discusses and records a lot of unpleasant things. Most notorious is the story found in Judges 19, where a priest chops up his concubine and mails her body parts to other people. And they didn't have Amazon Prime, so you know those packages took a long time. You can imagine the condition the contents arrived in. There is murder, incest, witchcraft, religious abuse, and hypocrisy all throughout Scripture. But that isn't the same as endorsing them. There are things in the world that have an influence, and so we study and discuss them. I have heard accusations that if something is even mentioned in a classroom, it is somehow an endorsement, but that's fear talking. Consider that in history courses we look at war, racism, genocide, and corruption. In psychology, we look at mental illness. In theology, we look at sin. In business, we have case studies on failed ethics, but none of those lessons, I hope, endorse those things. Instead, we become aware of them because they are real and they affect our identity and how we operate, and often serve as cautionary tales. Being ignorant isn't a virtue. The next two elements deal with media and communication theory, something many well-meaning believers and ministers are ignorant of when they begin to make accusations and assumptions about how what we consume affects us. Point number 4. Media cultivate ideas about the world. They don't dictate how we behave in the world. Video games cause violence. Violent movies make people do violent things. No doubt you've heard politicians and preachers say things like this. In 2012, a man shot up a movie theater during the screening of Batman: The Dark Knight. During a teacher conference that same year, the keynote speaker, a pastor, told educators that maybe this is why we should all avoid going to the movies. Keep in mind that we live with the tragedy of school shootings too, so maybe the pastor should have asked teachers to stop going to school. We also have the horrors of shootings at churches and mosques. Maybe the pastor should advocate against worship services. You get the point. Furthermore, most people who consume media, even violent media, don't behave in violent ways. In the 1960s and 70s, George Gerbner wanted to study the effects of violence on television. He noted that most shows contained violence and that television had become the dominant communication medium. What he discovered was that television violence didn't make you violent, but it might lead you to believe the world is more violent than it is, and that perception might make you act in certain ways. He labeled this cultivation theory. In other words, media cultivates certain perceptions of the world that can lead us to act in certain ways. For example, each year I lead a study tour to England. It's one of the highlights of my year. However, the first time I saw London, I was a little disappointed. All my previous knowledge of London was cultivated in Disney movies like Mary Poppins or Mickey's Christmas Carol. I pictured England as a medieval gas lamp-laden mysterious place. What I saw were skyscrapers, roundabouts, and people wearing modern clothes. Where were the chimney sweeps and thatched roof cottages? In Gerbner's research, he observed that people who watched crime dramas were more likely to believe their neighborhood was full of criminals. BBC murder mysteries are often set in the Cotswolds or English countryside. These beautiful locations are the sites of poisonings, homicide, kidnapping, and sabotage pies at the county fair.
There's no sign of Neville and his car's missing. We've put out an APB.
A bit early in the day to come calling, though.
Could say the same for you, sir.
No car, I've come to catch a lift from Gwen.
Gwen Morrison won't be going to work today.
Full name, that sounded official.
Gwen's body was found at the guillotine in the early hours of this morning.
Bobby.
She's been beheaded.
If all you knew of England were these shows, you might believe that quaint little villages like Evesham and Stratford-upon-Avon were the most dangerous places in the world. You might not choose to holiday there, even though they are spectacular locations with wonderful people. Gerbner's theory has been used and tested for decades with great results. Yet, there are cases when the media can tip someone right over the edge and lead them down the wrong path. But this is less about the media and more about the complex forces at work in an individual combined with the media. Communication theory textbooks use the analogy of a billiards table to explain how cultivation theory works. Picture a pool table with the colored balls spread out in different locations. Now imagine the white cue ball being struck by a cue, traveling right down the center of the table. The cue ball is a magnet that has a pull on all the balls it passes. Depending on the proximity to the cue ball, the colored balls will be pulled toward the cue ball, maybe even touching it. The cue ball represents the media, and the other balls represent people with their unique physical, psychological, and spiritual makeups. Some people will be hardly affected, if at all, by the media, while others will be significantly influenced. The idea that media can 100% take over a completely passive audience was known as the hypodermic needle or magic bullet theory, and was abandoned in the 1940s, even if fearmongers still cling to it. This is why claims that vampire novels make people drink blood, or video games will turn teens into necromancers feel disingenuous to media scholars. While there are occult elements in media that can have an influence, it's overshooting the runway to suggest that TV programs can mesmerize and possess people, like the television set in the movie Poltergeist.
They're here.
The result of these kinds of accusations makes people of faith look crazy and less credible, whereas a careful media critique, rooted in theory and research, paints a more helpful and nuanced picture and gives us a better chance of persuading people with our perspective. It's important to examine media and popular culture to see what kind of influence, worldviews, and associations they cultivate, but we have to avoid rash, oversimplified accusations of media directly causing everyone to do the most nightmarish thing based on whatever dark fantasy our terrified imaginations can come up with. Cultivation theory leads us to interrogate ourselves to see if there are any monsters that might be awoken if we spend too much time with certain media, and it leads us to stop making unsupportable claims regarding how others might be affected. Now, on to Philosophy 5. Different people use media to gratify different desires. Closely related to cultivation theory is uses and gratifications theory. In the 1940s, Israeli sociologist and communication scientist Elihu Katz changed the course of communication studies. While everyone had been asking what do media do with people, to the point of stagnating communication research, Katz asked, What do people do with media? I know, seems like no big deal now, but back then it really opened a new direction for investigating the media. He came up with 5 assumptions that underpinned his theory. 1. People use media for their own particular purposes. I usually use textbooks in my class. I read them because I'm looking for educational content and exercises for the class, and to keep up in my field. Some of my students will read it because they want to understand the content for their future professional life. Some will pore over it to get a good grade. Still, others may skim it just to get enough to complete the assignment and get out of Dr. Pierce's class. We all have our own purposes. The second assumption is that people seek to gratify certain needs with media. If someone plays the ridiculously difficult video game Elden Ring, they may have a variety of needs they seek to gratify. Obvious ones would be for entertainment, to escape what they feel is a boring life, or perhaps to feel powerful in another world because they don't feel very powerful in the non-digital world. Not so obvious ones are those who play the game because they are a video game blogger and need to give a review on a popular game, or they are bored and their cousin left his gaming console at their house, so they decided to pass the time by dying repeatedly for hours on end. Seriously, the game is so hard people have said it should have just been called You Died. The third assumption is the media competes for our time and attention. It should come as no surprise that countless media platforms, from billboards to the notifications in your phone, all compete for that most precious commodity, your attention. What uses and gratifications concerns itself with is, why do some people choose one type of media over another? Why do some people prefer online church to attending live worship services? What makes someone watch a blockbuster film on their mobile device instead of on the massive screen at an IMAX? Transformers just doesn't hit the same on a 6-inch screen as it does on a 52 by 72 foot screen. What makes someone choose to read the book instead of see the movie? And why do people play on their phones at the Thanksgiving dinner table rather than talk to Aunt Bertha sitting right across from them? I mean, she traveled a long way to be there and has some interesting stories. You can play Candy Crush later. All of us have to choose between competing media. So what usually gets your attention? Assumption 4 is that media affect people differently. When my family goes on road trips, we like to listen to music to pass the time, especially when we drive through Iowa on I-35 and there's nothing to see but plenty to smell. No offense to my Iowa friends. I enjoy epic soundtrack music when I drive. John Williams, Hans Zimmer, and Howard Shore are just a few of the composers whose works inspire me as I make my journey. I find the music energizing, but my wife does not. The way the drums, horns, and strings capture the moods of leaping off the rooftops in pursuit of criminals or standing in the bow of a pirate ship on the high seas makes me feel empowered, but makes her heart rate accelerate, causes her anxiety, and stresses her out. For the most part, media affects individuals differently, and even if they do have similar effects, the degree of intensity is different. The final assumption is that people can accurately report their media use and motivation. This is where things get a little fuzzy. While we can justify why we use certain media, and to some degree it is possible to know why you choose to engage in certain media, people seldom know all the reasons for why they do what they do, or even why they believe what they believe. People might be able to say they love Terminator 2 because they're a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, but if they reflected deeper, they might realize that the science fiction film helps them confront or validate their fears about artificial intelligence and technology taking over the world.
I need to know how Skynet gets built. Who's responsible?
The man most directly responsible is Miles Bennett Dyson.
Who is that?
He's the director of special projects at Cyberdyne Systems Corporation.
Why him?
In a few months, he creates a revolutionary type of microprocessor.
Go on. Then what?
In 3 years, Cyberdyne will become the largest supplier of military computer systems. All stealth bombers are upgraded with Cyberdyne computers, becoming fully unmanned. Afterwards, they fly with a perfect operational record. The Skynet funding bill is passed. The system goes online on August 4th, 1997. Human decisions are removed from strategic defense. Skynet begins to learn at a geometric rate. It becomes self-aware at 2:14 a.m. Eastern Time, August 29th. In a panic, they try to pull the plug.
Skynet fights back.
Yes.
There is a lot of disagreement among scholars over this assumption of uses in Gratz theory, and lots of robust discussion around any theory. I tell my students that no theory can explain everything, and as you find theories that really fascinate you and you dig deeper into them, you find very nuanced discussions and disagreements. For now, I mentioned cultivation theory and uses in Gratz theory, which is the shorthand for uses and gratifications, as a helpful way to reflect on the monster media we consume and discuss. Now, on to point number 6 in our monster hunting philosophy. Monster hunting is social archaeology. For years, I wanted a bullwhip. Any guesses why? Yeah, I saw the Indiana Jones trilogy, which cultivated the idea that archaeologists go on harrowing adventures and rely on whips to help swing over chasms and booby-trapped temples and fight bad guys. Since then, I've learned archaeology is a little different than that, and also very few people use whips anymore, save that one guy on TikTok, Adam Winrick.
Got enough whip orders to be like, yes, I think I can do this. And now it's mainly performing.
It's lucky he doesn't poke out an eye. Archaeologists spend a lot of time learning history and language before traveling all over the world to dig up artifacts from various cultures. Whether it's pottery, weapons, cultic implements, or ancient structures, or ancient books and literature and manuscripts, these artifacts help us understand the past and how people made sense of their worlds. We are social archaeologists, so we look at social artifacts, texts, movies, games, religious icons. We sort of dig them up and hold them up and examine them. We note how they may have been crafted, how people used them, how they influence us, and let people make decisions about how they will relate to them in their life. And we handle them very carefully to really understand what they're about instead of making assumptions. A weird example is how the movie The Exorcist actually inspired more people to sign up for the priesthood. In the book Theology and Horror, Kara Shimbakuru writes a chapter entitled Priests, Secrets, and Holy Water. She cites movie critic Pauline Kael as stating, quote, "The movie was the biggest recruiting poster the Catholic Church had since the sunnier days of Going My Way and the Bells of St. Mary's," end quote. The essay cites a non-Catholic by the name of Friedkin, who says he knew several people who went into the priesthood after that movie. No matter our personal feelings and convictions about the film The Exorcist, and there are a lot of opinions and feelings about that movie, it is of interest to religion and media scholars when Hollywood horror movies somehow inspire people to sign up for the ministry. Can you imagine the poor priest looking over seminary applications and several of them write in The Exorcist as the motivating factor for wanting to attend? There are a lot of strange artifacts we can dig up in popular culture. As we do, we want to handle them and scrutinize them with care in order to understand them and how they influence our world and what it means for us. Finally, number 7. Monster hunting involves the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule, found in Matthew 7:12, reminds us to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. As we hunt for the monsters and monstrous stories that haunt our histories and creep around popular culture, it's important to remember to handle them and the people who create them and the people who enjoy them with the same care and respect we would want to be treated with. Think about it. Has your belief system ever been misrepresented by the worst possible example? Last year, I taught on the campus of Nebraska Wesleyan University. The faculty received a text letting us know the infamous street preaching personality, Sister Cindy, will be on campus to warn students as explicitly and as loudly as possible about all the sexual sins she sees as plaguing young people. Students gather on a variety of campuses to witness the spectacle of what appears to be someone's unhinged fundamentalist grandma deploying the cringiest language possible. Students clap back, cheer, laugh, and mock.
I am here to do some good old-fashioned slut shaming. Yeah!
My husband and I take the confrontational approach to evangelism.
It's become a weird form of entertainment, a living satire of who Christians are. For many, this is what a preacher looks like. This is their association with Christianity and the church. It would be easy for a critic to hold this up and label all religions as behaving in this manner, instead of recognizing it as a unique example among a complex tapestry of religious expressions. As we sift through things, I intend, as far as possible in this podcast, to use descriptive language and less judgmental language. I'm not setting out with a suspicious attitude in order to uncover the secret nefarious purposes behind the media, mostly because that falls under a type of use to gratify a theological and personal need for power rather than truth. The author of a 1903 book entitled Education tells educators, quote, "Suspicion demoralizes, producing the very evils it seeks to prevent," end quote. So, unless we find express evidence otherwise, we won't assign motives in this podcast, but we will bring sacred texts and communication research into dialogue with artifacts in ways we would hope to have our content examined and discussed. Several years ago, one of my uncles told me about a deer hunting debacle he experienced. He was stalking his prey in the early morning hours in a snowy Minnesota wood when he came upon a buck. Quietly, he nocked an arrow and drew the bowstring back to his cheek, a little too close. Somehow the arrow snagged his snow mask, pulling the eye, nose, and mouth holes away from his face, blinding him to the target. He literally had pulled the wool over his own eyes. He stood there for a few awkward moments, unsure of what to do, unable to untangle his mask from his weapon. So he had no choice. He fired blind. He missed the deer, scared it off, and came home empty-handed, except for a great story. And thankfully, no one was hurt by the stray arrow. All of us need to develop our carefully thought-out philosophies for monster hunting, so we don't go in blind and miss the target, hurt ourselves or hurt someone else. I hope sharing my 7-point framework has provided a helpful place to start. Thank you for listening to Beast and Bible. Join me next time as we examine a connection between what would seem like two very different ideas, holiness and horror. Hosted, written, and produced by Dr. Seth Pierce. Edited by Andrew Osano. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Tech and equipment support by Steve Husett and James Gigante. Project support by Heather Moore. Special thanks to the North American Division and the Adventist Learning Community for making this podcast possible.
An Adventist Learning Community podcast.